So, Peter, what excited you when you saw Pink Floyd first, and in that very early session? What was it that kind of grabbed you about them?
What, when I saw them at the Marquee?
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first saw them. Well, I think the thing was that they didn't do the same solos as all the other bands did. You know, there wasn't the wailing blues guitar, which was the sort of standard issue. And the other thing, which was the abiding memory, is I couldn't work out where the noise was coming from. You know, because both Syd and Rick were playing with lots of Binson Eckerach in the solo, so there was this stuff going on, and I could, you know, the stage at the Marquee was sort of set forward a bit, so you could walk around. So I walked around to try and see what was going on and who was playing what, and that was what interested me, and these free-form solos that they did in the middle of the song. So they'd be doing Dust My Broom, or one of these sort of standard bluesy songs, or Louie Louie, and then there'd be a solo, and instead of the howling guitar, it was this strange noise. And I suspect, and I'm no musicologist, that what they did was it sort of was one chord jams, and they would just go off on a chord and just go on until, you know, they'd had enough of it, and then they'd go back into the song, you know. That impressed me or surprised me. That didn't sound like anything else I'd heard. And at that point I was looking for avant-garde pop music. That time the Beatles were doing things like Revolver and stuff, and they were starting going avant-garde. And Rubber Soul and those things. So one could see that the music was opening out. There was Hey Mr. Tambourine and the Birds and 8 Miles High and these things. So that music, and Bob Dylan, and generally speaking, pop music was becoming much more interesting and more challenging, and which I think that was, and that within that people were beginning to sell lots of albums and lots of records if they were called pop. So I worked out that if we were ever going to pay to keep the label going, let alone make any money, which wasn't really our prime consideration, then we would have to sell a lot of records, which means we'd have to have a pop group, because the Beatles sold a lot of records by then. We already knew that the Beatles made a lot of money, the Rolling Stones were selling a lot of records, the Kinks, I think, had started selling records, the Who had started selling records. So the idea that a British pop band could sell records was there. So that's why I then, having heard them, I thought, this is an avant-garde pop band.
If you were, what would you say about the dynamics of the group, about Pink Floyd at that point, at the early stage?
Well, on the basis of the one gig, on the basis of the initial gig, it was clearly Syd was the front man, and he was a sort of good-looking boy, you know, and he sang the vocals. You couldn't really hear much about the vocals, because back then you couldn't really hear vocals at gigs with bands. And I like them. I like their sort of their improvised nature of their instrumental bits, and that was what really got me, was the improvised instrumental bits, which were not the same as all the other things that one heard around that time.
And it was Syd rather than Roger that stood?
Oh, absolutely. It was Syd and Rick, because there was also quite some nice harmonies. I think Rick was doing a lot of stuff, and I always had early days, and perhaps even later, it was always a bit of, sometimes quite difficult to sort out what was Rick and what was Syd. I mean, they really worked very well together. I mean, the dynamics of the band was that Roger, in a way, was always the sort of bit of the sort of businessman stroke organisation person. Nick had his very unique drum sound, which was, you know, he wasn't a great drummer, but he did what he did, and it worked really well with the band. And I think the band sound was partly built around that sort of very basic Roger Nick rhythm thing. And then it was Rick and Syd's sort of harmonic thing, with all the sort of, you know, the chordy things and the sustained things. And then obviously there was one or two of Syd's songs that they played at that early gig, but it was mainly the blues covers. And then Rick you know, subsequently Rick was the musician. Rick was the musician, did in the studio and things, did a lot of the harmonies and worked out all that stuff and helped sort of tell people when they're in tune and when they're out of tune, and was able to cope with musical structures. The rest of them were not particularly musical. I mean, Syd was an instinctive musician. Andrew King has always maintained that he was a better musician. I'm not sure. I never really thought of him as I thought of him always as being creative rather than as being as a musician, whereas I thought of Rick as Rick being a musician who was creative, whereas Syd was creative who was a musician.
Roger
was the person who helped hold it all together. I mean, and that in a way was often, to be brutal, the bass player in the band back then was often the person who had the transit van or the PA. You know, it was like, well, we need the PA, so we'll have him on bass. Now Roger wasn't that, but I think he always had a lot to do with holding it together and giving the drive. Because Rick was out there, Nick went with the flow, and Syd was interested in the creativity. And I think Roger was always much more involved with the sort of professional line of the band.
If you think of Syd, he had as we know, a very short creative arc and a career arc. Is it possible to encapsulate it, to summarise it, to say what you think were the highlights of his creative career?
I think that what happened was that through the sort of UFO and the London Free School and all that stuff, he realised that he was actually, and the interest that people had in what he did, I think it improved his self-esteem a lot. And he was encouraged to write songs by myself and Andrew and possibly the band, because we knew that was one of the places where people, you know, all the successful bands wrote their own material by then, or were beginning to. And so you could see that was clearly an important part of distinctiveness, that, you know, if it was just another blues band, you know, he wasn't a virtuoso guitar player, you know. We weren't going to cut it as that. I think that was sort of instinctive, you know. We weren't going to beat John Mayall's Blues Breakers at that game. We weren't going to beat Chris Farlow. We weren't going to beat the Ram Jam band. But we did sort of have something in that arty world. And we were talking back then about multimedia. I mean, the first handouts we did for the Floyd, we talked about multimedia experience. And that was always, I was cashing in on, yes, why not? We were cashing in on that whole hippie underground notions, which we didn't really know what they were, because the gap between America and England was much bigger than it is now. And so we didn't really know what was going on in San Francisco, but we read bits and pieces about it, little clips here and there. And we'd heard about Jack Kerouac, and, you know, there'd been the Poetry Olympics. So there were a few links with America, and then, you know, the Stones would talk about things and the Beatles, and so you read a bit about it. But the whole sort of underground scene in America was a sort of bit legendary. And there was definitely an element at which at the Free School and UFO we were, as it were, recreating that San Francisco thing, but without actually knowing what it was. And I think that was part of what Syd was doing. He was tapping into that. So he started writing a lot more. He had written, but I think they felt the need to be a blues band earlier on, and I think that we helped, or the environment helped them to liberate themselves from being a not very good blues band to being a very good Pink Floyd. And by bringing in the lights and so on, that it made them something else. That was great showbiz. Again, not consciously particularly, but that was because we were trying to create a sort of a psychedelic environment. And Syd was very conscious of all that, and was very supportive of all that, and you know, we would talk about that sort of area.
Do you think, So Syd's writing, I suppose, kind of moved through. Do you think it matured?
Yeah, I mean, I think he got a lot more confidence in it, and he realised it was quite easy. I think he'd been writing songs before because of his notebooks. We knew that there was subsequently we knew there were lots of earlier songs, but they were very childlike. His early songs were all Effervescing Elephant and things like that. They were very childlike, and I think that by going into the sort of hippie thing, he was able to get more into into Lewis Carroll and that sort of as it were more imaginative childlike thing rather than being sort of more nursery rhymey and but he always, I think, probably fair to say, he always had a very sort of childlike vision of the world, and he was able to sort of tap into that sort of that very British tradition of humour and imagery. You know that his bike, their songs and stuff like that, and then the more hippie stuff, which Astronomy Domini and so on. So Interstellar Overdrive was a more sort of extended instrumental thing, and that was influenced by listening to Love. I mean that the story there is that I hummed I think it's I've forgotten what song it was, but a love song to Syd, and he played it, but I can't sing for nuts, and so I was horribly out of tune. So he got the essence of it and that was Interstellar Overdrive, and so that was a very, very important part of their thing, because that was the song where they were as it were, they were free to improvise and to play in extended songs. And from very early on, their songs became extended. You know, the average song, instead of being 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and one brief instrumental break, their songs would be 3, 4, 5 minutes long, and more improvised, more free, and that was, I think, that all those sorts of things were very important.
If you we know about Syd's decline and the tragedy of Syd in a sense, very much so. But I'm trying to kind of. So do you see there's any kind of creative progression from, say, the childlike to his own, say, through Source Full of Secrets, with his one Syd song on the Jug Band Blues, and his own solo stuff, where it seems in a way it's kind of far more personal, kind of small scale in his world, in his head, and away from that kind of playfulness.
It was less fun and more sort of self-analysing, I think. I mean, I think the key song for me is Jug Band Blues is one of them, but the other two songs is Scream the Last Scream and Vegetable Man, which are hard to find, but they're around and should be out. I think it's a scandal that they're not out, because I think those are two really, if you want to understand Syd, listen to those songs, because that is where he ended up. If you want to see where he started, you look at things like, Bike and, Effervescing Elephant. I don't know, some of those songs are around somewhere or another, but some of those early, very jolly little childlike songs. And you could see that through his writing, he became more sort of mature, more grown up, sort of more sort of looking outwards more. So, Astronomy Domini was about sort of space and moon and Sputniks and all that, the implications of all that. And then he became involved in describing himself. I mean, I think that Jug Band Blues is about him. And I think that Vegetable Man is about him, and very consciously about him. He wrote that in our flat, and he was describing himself. I mean, that was what the lyrics are about, describing who he was and where he was at that time. It was an extraordinary song, and I think Jug Band Blues was an expression of his confusion about where life was going, what was happening in the world and in his head, and in the world in general and his particular world. Yeah.
So it's kind of naked. It's very, very much sort of tapping into something raw in the Jug Band Blues.
It's more than raw. It's quite scary, isn't it? You know, and extraordinarily avant-garde. I mean, he really was by then very experimental and stuff. And that was the problem, I think, in a sense. It was so sort of intuitively experimental. There was no sort of structure around which the experiments could occur. There was a sort of, as it were, no limit. Once he was doing all the acid and things, it would just go out there, and that was, to me, was a tragedy. I think the other thing, which is a very interesting thing about Syd, is Golden Hair, which I always thought was his song, but which he'd picked up this great James Joyce lyric, a melody around it, and I thought that was a wonderful song, and I think implied a sort of much more sort of grown up, mature thing in his head than you know, in a sense one gave him credit for, you know.
So when the sort of slide into real instability happened, this whole issue around Syd and whether he should stay in the band or leave and who should replace him. Can you tell us a bit about that? Obviously those discussions must have been very painful for you at that point, and you're kind of agonising about it. Can you tell us?
Well, I mean, agonising, schmagonising. I mean, I think it was extremely painful for him and the band. I think for Andrew and I, what we were trying to do was to hold it together, and we spent sort of, it seemed like a year, but it was probably 3 months trying, after that American tour, which Andrew came back from, and there's clearly from there on in, there was trouble going on, right through to the Hendrix tour, when Syd started not turning up to some of the gigs and things, and we had to have someone in to be a dep for him just in case, and then ending up with the band not knowing what he was going to play at a gig, you know, so they'd go and do a gig, and Syd wouldn't give them a list, and if he, you know, any song that they played that he wouldn't necessarily play it, he would just go off on one. So it was it was a very difficult time, and we spent a lot of time trying to hold them together, and that was, in a sense, it was really valuable for them, because they had to leap in, the other three, they had to leap into the, it was becoming clear that they would have to sort out, they couldn't rely on Syd to deliver the next hit, they couldn't rely on Syd to sing the song, they couldn't rely on him to write the set list. So in a sense, in a way it was quite good possibly for them. It was a painful 3 months, or however long it was, but it was sort of 3 or 4 months in which they started to take control of the band, particularly Roger, and he was the first one to write any sort of songs which had any sort of any conviction as songs. Rick did a couple of things, and they did some things together, but that was, I think, the big challenge that we saw, was how on earth they were going to get these songs, you know, because I mean, See How Many Play had been a big hit. How are we going to get another hit? If you don't have a hit, you don't get money in the gigs. If you don't get good gigs with good money, how do you keep the band going? How do you pay the taxes that we hadn't paid? How do you know, there was all these sort of pressures building up from, as it were, our naive shooting to fame, and being business incompetence, and them being professional incompetence in many ways. So we were all incompetent in different ways, and it was a sort of really drastic learning thing. So what did we do? Well, we saw what had happened to Brian Wilson by remote, by what we read in the papers. So we developed the idea that Syd maybe could be the, could write the songs. And the band brought in Dave, who had been involved somehow before my time, had been part of their gang in Cambridge. So he was part of their world. And I just remember hearing Dave doing his sort of demo in Studio 3 at Abbey Road and doing an extraordinary Hendrix imitation. So Dave was a terrific guitar player and could do, Hendrix. He was able to do Syd. And I didn't realise, it took me some time to realise that far from just doing them, he was actually there was Dave Gilmour, the guitar player in there, and I'm a huge fan of Dave's guitar playing, and I think he became a good singer as well. Roger sang despite his innate lack of musicality. I mean, Roger is an incredible achievement, really, because he is not naturally musical. He didn't have a natural ear, but he learned it, and he developed his craft and became so that he could sing and he could play the bass and all these things that he went on to do. He could write. The writing was not such a problem because he was always a literate person, very bright, so that doing lyrics and things would be so much more natural for him, and he was always very articulate. So those things, but learning the music, that was extraordinary. And then organising how the band worked and did, he would be involved in thinking about the lights and things more, and Rick and Dave would be more involved with the music, and Nick would try and keep everybody together. Nick was always the person who would able to move between all factions, all sections, all difficulties. Nick was a delightful person in terms. He was really sort of the cement which held a lot of it all together, both musically because of the way he played the drums, which gave it sort of a character in the music. Had a lot to do with those sort of the beaters and those sort of rhythm patterns that he played. That sort of thing, rather than boom crash, boom crash, boom crash. He was that was a lot of the character, and I think that Roger as well, because he wasn't a sort of virtuoso bass player, played very simple, rooty sort of bass lines, which then gave that freedom for Rick and Dave to do what they did, and earlier on for Syd to do what he did, to go across it. So it was a very sort of basic, simple patterns on which you could be very free on top, and I think that's what Syd liked, But in the writing, it was. His writing did mature and became very, very difficult. But for us, back to what we saw. We saw the idea of somehow keeping. Could we keep the creativity that was Syd within the context of the band? And I think the double problem was that the creativity was disappearing into the fog. And it was really just too hard for the band to work with him. It was just, in all ways, becoming very, very difficult.
Your decision was to go with Syd, in a sense, and not to follow the band. Was it inevitable that you would take that route?
Yes, I guess so. Certainly, because I was closer to Syd than to any of the other three. I spent more time with him, and I wasn't a businessman. I wasn't, I couldn't see, basically, and I think Andrew was the same. I couldn't see how the band could survive without Syd's creative input. And I think that, in some senses, I think I was right. I couldn't have predicted that they would be so good at building on those foundations and being consistent to what had been set out in the original blueprints of the Floyd, and to then take that and develop that in the way that they did. And I was stunned. I mean, in a sense, I'm consistently stunned by it. I mean, and the more I look back and the greater I have hindsight on that, the more remarkable it is that they were able to take the germ of the idea that was so strongly was coming from Syd, so much was coming from Syd, and to sort of fill that gap, which he left when he went, because you were losing your songwriter, your lead singer, your front man, and your guitar player and your lead guitar player, your main melodic person. The band revolved around Syd. You lose Syd and you still keep going and you build from there. Fantastic.
Then a few years later, Syd, in a sense, becomes the subject, the inspiration for this album, Wish You Were Here.
Yeah.
Did that surprise you? How did you react when you heard that?
I think I hear it more and more as time went. I heard it more and more as time went on. Their awareness. I think there was a huge amount of loss, guilt, respect in their relationship to Syd. There was something about what had happened to Syd which somehow we all felt that, was it our fault? Had we done it? Could we help? So I did a bit of producing with Syd, I did some sessions with Syd and tried to get songs out of him. Then Roger and Nick, together or apart or separately, tried to take some of that material that myself and Malcolm Jones got and try and bring some, try and get some structure and shape in them, and to make them to make those sketches. In a sense, what they were doing, I think, they were turning a sketch into a painting. Syd did the sketch. I find those later Syd things very disturbing. I don't like listening to them. I feel it's the craft had disintegrated too far. The great thing about, to me, what I've said in the past is, and I'll say it again, is I think those songs that I talked about, those final songs, the Floyd, that he did with the Floyd, Scream Your Last Scream, Vegetable Man, and Jug Band Blues, were like those Van Gogh paintings when he was really losing it. The cornfields and the birds. You look at that and you can see mental turbulence. You hear about Van Gogh, you read a bit about Van Gogh, you look at that thing and say, oh wow, it's all there. And that's the same thing. I mean, he's got that. If you want to understand mental trouble and disturbance, you look at those pictures and you read about Van Gogh and you look at those pictures. They tell you a lot about it. They tell you more than all the pretentious crap from the psychiatrists and the psychologists, I think. And the same with Syd. You can hear in that what is happening to his breakdown, and that was just so upsetting. I can't tell you how so. It was like seeing someone sort of drowning and trying to pull them out, but they were kept on slip. The hand slipped away all the time. So we were doing that when they're trying to hold the band together. I did it when we were in the studio with him. I was trying to find. You could hear glimpses of it. You could still hear bits of Syd would come through, bits of melody, bits of lyric, bits of pieces, and but you couldn't turn those sketches into a picture. They were just doodles or initial drafts. You couldn't do anything really with them, and I think that I just let him play and try and hope that something would come out. And then I think what they did, what Dave and Roger did, was try and take those bits and turn them into something coherent with what they thought would do. And I think they did a great job with it. I've got no criticism, but I found it too disturbing. I found it so upsetting working with Syd in those days, because it was like trying to bring him back. Come back, Syd, come back.
You took him into the studio I think for the last time, in August 1974.
Yeah.
And had like 3 or 4 days of sessions that there are. I have a recording of them, and they're very. I mean, there's nothing really there. So it's fragile. It's kind of fleeting. It's disappearing.
Yeah.
It's painful to listen to it.
Indeed, and I mean, it's a trite. It's not a trite analogy. It's an analogy I've used before. It reminds me of my childhood of seeing a trolleybus which is silent in one of those London P Super fogs in the 50s, and a trolleybus would come out of the fog and you couldn't see the top of it. You could just see the lights, and then it would come in without saying anything, no noise. And people would get on, then it would go away and it would disappear. So it appeared and it disappeared. And to me, it's a sort of childhood image which was just incredibly strong in my mind. And that's always what I felt those sessions with Syd were like. It was like that trolleybus. He was that trolleybus, And things would come out and then it would disappear again into the fog, come out of the fog and disappear into the fog. And then maybe something else would come out, and you sat there and waited. And try and get him to play it again, and that was good, Syd, can you do that again, and it was just didn't work, he was willing, I think. I don't know where he was, and there's the other great thing was the second engineer, the tape op, who worked out that when Syd left Abbey Road, if he turned left, he wouldn't come back, and if he turned right, he would. And every now and then he'd leave and go out for a break, and that was true. If he went left, or left or right, doesn't matter which one it was. But if he went one way, he didn't come back. If he went the other way, he did come back. Very mysterious, very mysterious, and very, very disturbing, very sad, because. He was in many ways the most creative person I've ever met. So that's why that was the scar on the Floyd, because they too, I think, he's probably the most creative person they'd ever met, and the most who turned them on to their music, who opened the path. I mean, Roger and Syd had been friends at school, or known each other at school, hadn't they? And Dave, I think, was part of the gang. They were all old, from teenagers together. And he was the sort of the bright spark who sort of got it all going for them and helped create their world, and then he disappeared from their world. And I think that's why it's had such an impact. That the other thing that, of course, is the death of Roger's father is the other big thing, isn't it, in his life. And professionally, they're more important than your girlfriend or the wife. It was a sort of really formative thing. I mean, Syd had a huge impact on our lives. I mean, none of us would be where we are now if it hadn't been for Syd, and we all knew that. I would probably still be, I'd probably be a retired school, university teacher, probably having been sacked from being a wastrel and ended up at the University of Nowhere, to get Lucky Jim style, sort of trying to scam my way through, as opposed to being a sort of referred to as a living legend in the music industry, and I think, well, good God, I'm just a scammer anyway. But anyway, that's another story.